My name is Kathryn Nanz. I'm the developer advocate for Kendo React at Progress. But that was not always what I planned to be doing. In fact, I have a fine arts degree. I went to school to study studio arts. I became a graphic designer and worked in ad agencies for several years afterwards. I could probably fill a whole second talk just talking about the bizarre experience of starting off in design and moving all the way over into software engineering. But I really only bring that up today to give you a little bit of context on why I'm here talking about design and DataViz design specifically. Data visualization is such an interesting concept because it sits in the middle of some very different worlds. Obviously, there's the actual data part of it, the raw numbers, the statistics, the math. Then there's a technical aspect, especially in the context of creating React applications. Those graphics are often interactive or animated in some way. So how do we best approach building that? Those two aspects are probably the ones that you're most familiar with as engineers. For a lot of folks, that's also the place where they stop. We're not going to be spending too much time today talking about those things because I bet you already know that process pretty well. You import the data, you pass that data into a chart, maybe something from an external library like Kendo React or D3, and there you go, data visualization. However, that approach leaves out two other very important aspects of creating effective data viz: the story and the design. All data tells a story. The question for us is, what are we trying to communicate with the data, and what do we want our users to take away? Even if our intention is to just set the data in front of our users and let them draw their own conclusions, the choices that we make in data presentation will greatly influence how a viewer interprets it, for better or for worse. Which means that, by nature, design is a huge part of data visualization. It's the way that we are telling that story. And that's really what we're going to be focusing on primarily today. But it's important to acknowledge that that kind of design doesn't happen in a vacuum. And all those other factors, the information, the technology, and the story, all have an influence on the design choices that we make. One of the most important parts of DataViz design, or really just design in general, is meeting and matching your user's expectations. 90% of the time, when a user is confused by a data visualization, it's because they're not sure how they're supposed to read this graphic. It's either not labeled clearly, it's not accessible, it doesn't follow an expected pattern, or the presentation method doesn't actually match the data that it's displaying. Sometimes, if you work in marketing or with marketers, you might have heard the term surprise and delight, which is this idea that you should include something that's different or unexpected to kind of shake up your approach and give your users something that's different or exciting. This does not actually apply to DataViz. The graphic itself should always be kind of secondary and supporting to the data, because if you're surprising your users, then you're also, by nature, distracting them. And that's not to say that you can't do beautiful and interesting things with data visualizations. I promise I am not dooming you to an eternity of black and white line graphs. Just that there are some guide rails that you'll want to be aware of when you're creating effective data visualizations. Because at the end of the day, that effectiveness of communication is the part that's really important. Half the battle here is choosing the best format for your information. You'll want to select a graphic style that most accurately answers the question your users are trying to answer with your data. So with that goal in mind, let's talk through some common questions that people ask about data, as well as the best suited visualizations to answer those questions and some challenges to be aware of. One of the most common questions to ask about a set of data is how it's shifted over a period of time. Have your profits gone up since Q1? Is our app getting more downloads than we were 6 months ago? What did my heart rate look like over the last 15 minutes of working out? Most of the time in these situations, we want to make use of more kind of horizontal visualizations where time is represented along the bottom and the metric of measurement along the side. This is the pattern that most of your users will be looking for in this kind of visualization. So again, it's really important to meet them where they expect you to be. Bar charts and line graphs are the most popular opinions for this approach, since both will offer an easy way to visualize the passage of time as compared to the measurement. but some other good options might be a timeline or a waterfall chart. You should always opt for the simplest data visualization that effectively answers your user's question. If you can accurately and easily tell the story with a line graph, then don't bother with a waterfall chart. That added complexity is only going to make it more difficult for your users to interpret. If there's value that you can add by using a more complex visualization, then by all means, go for it. But if there's not, the added time and effort to decipher it on your user's end will only feel frustrating. Another really common question has to do with how the data breaks down into subsets. How many people chose answer A as opposed to answer B? How much of our income are we spending on rent every month? Which of our products is generating the most profit for the company? In these situations, we need something that can isolate parts within a greater whole, and the most obvious answers are pie charts and donut charts. I recommend using a pie chart when it's more important for your users to be able to see every subsection because it's easier for them to interpret. The larger blocks of color kind of jump out. It's easier to make comparisons on which is bigger or smaller. The donut chart, on the other hand, is great when you just want to highlight the majority. It also offers you the opportunity to maybe put some extra information in the center to kind of reinforce your story. This could help you highlight primary takeaways or just add a little bit of white space to your design. If you need to measure parts against the whole while also tracking that information against the passage of time, stacked bar or stacked area graphs are your best bet. Depending on the number of subsets within your information, though, these can get pretty complex, so make sure you're dedicating lots of space. Sometimes we need to see how one thing stacks up against another. Which feature did our users rank as their most wanted, or what's the highest grossing movie of all time? When the question is relatively simple, our data visualization should be as well. It can be tempting to overcomplicate these kinds of things. Sometimes we feel like it's our job to create a big, impressive design, and that can lead to the bad practice of adding more and more unnecessary elements in order to make something look fancier or more interesting. However, it's important to remember that the primary goal of all design, and DataViz in particular, is to communicate an idea. It's far more important for your graphics to be easily and quickly understandable than it is for them to feel artistic or impressive. Most of the time, this really isn't an either-or choice because you can completely create data visualizations that are beautiful and effective, but the next time you catch yourself thinking about adding one more purely decorative element or using something that's more visually complex, consider whether or not you really need it. That being said, when we're talking about simple comparisons like this, it's best to stick to the classics. Ranked lists, bubble charts, bar charts, all excellent options here. Finally, are there relationships or correlations between these pieces of data? Occasionally, we're in the unique position of having multiple sets of data that we need to show together in one visualization. Is there any correlation between income and life expectancy? Does the number of hours that you study actually impact your grade on the final exam? In this situation, you could be looking to juxtapose them to show differences or to highlight correlations. No matter the reason, though, it can be a challenge to show off two sets of data at once. In these situations, interactivity can also be a really powerful tool. We'll talk in just a minute about some guidelines for creating interactive data visualizations in just a minute, but for now it's enough to say that offering this kind of additional layer of information can really help to clarify complicated graphics. Scatter plots are often the best match for this kind of data display. They do a great job of visualizing a lot of data at a glance, and the cluster of dots is a really strong and easily understood visualization for understanding groups and trends. But beyond scatter plots, you can also reach for things like heat maps, correlation matrices, and bubble charts. Now that we've got kind of a feel for some of the different options we have, let's start talking about making it interactive. Because one of the coolest parts of data visualization on the web or in applications is that we get to include the user's input in our work. If you're working in print, you just kind of have to guess at what the user is most likely to be interested in, or try to provide different versions of the same graphic adjusted to focus on or highlight different parts of the data. But in our case, we can provide a default and then allow the user to filter, zoom, pan, whatever they need to really explore more and get involved with the information that we're giving them. We don't have to guess what they want in the same way. We can give them the tools to adjust our data, show them exactly what they want every time. That being said, there are some pros and cons to interactivity. On the pro side, it is a great way to embed a lot of information in not a lot of space. By giving users the ability to hover or click on things for more detailed information, you can keep the graphic itself more streamlined and simplified. In general, I am a big fan of giving your users this power whenever possible. When you could make something interactive and you choose not to, it can sometimes come with the implication that you don't actually want the user to look closely at your data. It comes back to that idea of the story that you're telling. If you're not really allowing them to dive deep and poke around in all of this data, then is there something you're trying to hide? Is there a view that you don't want them to see? What's so important about allowing them to only see the data presented in one specific way? And again, to return to that idea of meeting user expectations, a lot of users now have come to expect that data visualizations on the web will be at least somewhat interactive, that they'll be able to hover and click and zoom. And when you can't, it can feel like a little bit of a red flag. On the flip side, there are downsides to interactivity you need to be aware of. Of course, a larger technical lift. Anytime we're talking interactivity in React, we're adding like state management stuff, and by nature, that makes it more difficult to maintain. Also, if your app is really heavily data focused, you'll need to consider whether or not your users should be able to save that specific configuration that they've created. Because if they spent 5 or 10 minutes filtering and sorting a really complex chart to show them just what they want, they'll be frustrated if they have to do it over and over again. It's also worth keeping in mind that you can never assume that your users will click or explore the visualization. While some people might be really into that, others might skim past it and not interact at all. If you have information in that graphic that is truly critical and needs to be communicated, it should never be hidden behind interactivity. You can't depend on them hovering on each one of the bars in your bar chart in order to see an exact number or percentage. So if that's important, then it needs to be visible on the first load. The IBM design language has some really great guidance on this. They say, overview first, zoom and filter, then details on demand. This means at first glance, your user should still be able to get the gist of any information that you're showing them without having to interact at all. Then allow them to kind of focus in, narrow down on the exact subset that they want to explore, and show those really precise details only if asked. This can be a really good rule of thumb. And speaking of thumbs, you'll also have to consider your users on mobile or on tablet. How difficult is it for them to interact with your data visualizations if they're not using a mouse? How easily can you target those buttons, filters, and other interactive items if you're touch tapping on a phone? Which really brings us to our next item of consideration, which is responsiveness. Anything that we are building today needs to be fully responsive, especially now when remote work has become so common and more people are working from anywhere, using phones and tablets for business purposes. The thought of somebody sitting in an office at a desk, loading your app on a desktop computer, is rapidly becoming pretty outdated. But that being said, data visualizations on mobile are hard. We're working with some seriously limited space, and data visualizations are already squeezing a lot of information into a really small area. Making them smaller runs the risk of them becoming unreadable. And as mentioned, changing from a mouse and keyboard input to touch and tap really drastically reduces accuracy when it comes to clicking, scrolling, and panning. So what can we do? The first step is to make the obvious adjustments to your data visualization to make it as responsive as possible. You probably already know this kind of stuff. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Make sure that your text is adjusting smaller. Make sure that you're always using responsive or percentage-based CSS units. Make sure that if it overflows off the side, people can move and scroll. This seems silly, but it is something that is very often overlooked. Simple visualizations like bar charts, pie charts, they can look really great on a phone as long as we've made those few small tweaks to ensure that they resize correctly. But when that's not enough, it's time to see if you can simplify the data visualization while still keeping the most useful parts of the data. For example, here's a scatter plot designed at 2 different sizes. When the screen is large, we can add a little bit more detail. We've got the names over each data point and the more precise markings along each axis. In the smaller version, we simplify, take some of that stuff away. It's kind of dependent on what story you're telling as to whether or not this will work, right? Because if it's really important that your users are able to measure specific data points against each other, then they really need those individual labels. But if it's more important for them to look at things and get an overall feeling for trends, then something like reducing the labels can make things a lot better and produce a really improved user experience on a phone. If we can't get it to look good with any of those adjustments, or are unable to simplify the presentation of the data, then it's time to take a graceful degradation approach. What are other ways of presenting the same information that might not be as ideal or as interactive, but will be more small screen friendly? For example, if you're showing population per city, a bar chart might be the best and most interesting solution, but a ranked list could be a really good alternative for a small screen. In this case, you could show that bar chart until it becomes too small, then use a media query, swap over to the ranked list. And if all else fails, a data grid is often a great kind of catch-all solution. It's a place where you can display all of the data. It's very naturally scrollable, so it works well even on small screens. Plus, with filtering, sorting, and grouping, your users can narrow down the wide variety of data into the specifics they need, but using mobile-friendly controls like drop-downs and search bars, instead of having to deal with a more complex and specific to your DataViz kind of control. That's not ideal. Obviously, it's not as visual to just throw everything into a grid and hope for the best, but it is infinitely better than some beautiful data visualization that your user cannot actually use.